The heavy, manila envelope rested on the kitchen table like a ticking bomb. Inside lay 16 pages of court-ordered, sealed psychological evaluations, intake logs, and red-stamped police incident reports. For 6 months, I had deliberately chosen not to read them. I had wanted to know the 15-year-old boy sitting across from me without the shadow of his past dictating who he was allowed to become. But as I watched Leo quietly stare down at his untouched dinner, his knuckles white against his fork, I realized that ignoring the past doesn't stop it from bleeding into the present. My name is David Miller. At 42, I'm a high school literature teacher living in a quiet suburb just outside of Seattle. 2 years after losing my wife, Clara, to a sudden illness, my home felt less like a sanctuary and more like a mausoleum filled with silent memories. I didn't enter the foster care system looking to fill a void. I entered because I spent my days watching kids slip through the cracks of a world that judged them before understanding them. When county caseworker Sarah Jenkins first brought Leo's file to my office, her expression carried a warning masked as fatigue. Leo had been through 9 placements in 4 years. Every single family had returned him to the state system within months, citing extreme emotional detachment, explosive outbursts, and an unsettled violence that scared them. The system had effectively labeled him unadoptable, a lost cause waiting to turn 18 so he could become another statistic. The first time Leo walked into my house, he didn't look like a threat. He looked like a shadow attempting to occupy physical space. Tall for his age, with sharp collarbones and dark, hyper-vigilant eyes, he moved through the hallway like someone expecting the floor to give way beneath him. He didn't offer a greeting, nor did he scan the room for comfort. His eyes immediately mapped out the exit routes, the front door, the back kitchen slider, the window in the downstairs hallway. For the first 3 weeks, our interactions were defined by an unspoken protocol of survival. Leo spoke only when direct answers were required, his voice low, flat, and stripped of inflection. He kept his bedroom door locked from the inside, a violation of the foster contract that I quietly ignored. Every night at precisely 1 a.m., I would hear the creak of his bedroom door, followed by the faint sound of his socks dragging across the hardwood floor as he checked the deadbolts on the exterior doors before retreating back into the dark. The breakthrough didn't come from a dramatic speech or a staged father-son moment. It happened over a rusted carburetor from an old 1978 pickup truck sitting in my garage. Leo had spent an entire Saturday morning staring at the disassembled parts laid out on an old tarp. He didn't ask to join, and I didn't offer an invitation. I simply handed him a wrench and pointed to the manifold. For 4 hours, we worked in total silence, hands stained with black grease, unified by the simple, predictable logic of mechanical repair. By the 4th month, the razor-thin tension hanging over the house began to thaw. The sudden, defensive flinches when I reached past him for a salt shaker became less frequent. A dry, subtle sense of humor began to emerge from behind his guarded posture. He started sitting in the living room while I graded papers, reading through my old classic novels without being prompted. For the first time in years, the house felt like a living home rather than a collection of empty rooms. Then came the incident at the regional high school. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my phone rang in the middle of my prep period. The vice principal's voice was tense, urging me to come to the main office immediately. When I arrived, 2 campus resource officers were standing outside the door. Inside, a junior named Tyler was sitting with an ice pack pressed against a swelling jaw, while Leo sat isolated in the corner, his eyes deadened, his face completely devoid of emotion. He had reverted back to the hollow shell I had seen on his first day. According to the administrator, a brief argument in the cafeteria had escalated instantly when Leo struck Tyler, knocking him over a lunch table. The school was threatening immediate expulsion and legal charges. But when I pulled Leo into the hallway, away from the glaring fluorescent lights and administrative judgment, I didn't raise my voice. I looked at him and simply asked, "Are you all right?" Leo's head snapped up, his defense mechanisms momentarily short-circuiting. He was clearly preparing for an outburst, for condemnation, for the inevitable call to the caseworker to pack his bags once again. "You're not going to yell at me," he muttered, his voice trembling slightly beneath a layer of forced indifference. "Everyone else did. That's usually the part where you tell me I don't belong here." "I don't care about everyone else, Leo," I told him quietly, looking him dead in the eye. "I care about what happened in there, and I care about you. We'll fix the school situation together. But you have to talk to me." That night, for the first time since he moved in, Leo stayed downstairs after dinner. He sat on the couch, pulled his knees up to his chest, and confessed that Tyler had spent weeks taunting him about being a throwaway kid, culminating in a cruel remark about how his real parents had dumped him because he was broken. The punch hadn't been an act of random cruelty. It had been the desperate, wounded lash-out of a boy who believed the world saw him as worthless. I managed to negotiate a suspension instead of an expulsion, agreeing to clear my schedule and monitor him at home for the week. The incident brought us closer than we had ever been, building a fragile bridge of trust that felt genuine, real, and irreversible. Leo had finally begun to believe that this house was a permanent refuge, and that I was someone who wouldn't give up on him when things got difficult. Which brought me right back to the heavy manila envelope resting on my kitchen table. With Leo upstairs asleep, I finally broke the seal, pulling out the confidential court file that Sarah Jenkins had delivered earlier that afternoon. The official records had been unsealed due to the ongoing adoption process we were preparing to formalize. As I turned the pages, expecting to read standard reports of neglect or financial instability, the cold reality of the documents hit me like physical blow. The official story Leo had been told his entire life, the story that his biological parents had simply abandoned him at a fire station because they were too young and overwhelmed, was a complete fabrication designed to protect his psychological stability. The police reports detailed a dark, chilling reality. 15 years ago, Leo's biological father hadn't abandoned him out of desperation. He had been a deeply unstable, dangerous man who had systematically orchestrated a crime that destroyed his family, leaving Leo's biological mother severely damaged and forcing state authorities to step in under total secrecy to protect the child's physical safety. The records clearly stated that the truth of the father's actions had been legally classified, with explicit psychological notes warning that revealing the reality to the child could inflict irreparable psychological trauma. I stared at the pages in front of me, the warm ambient light of my kitchen suddenly feeling cold and oppressive. Leo was sitting upstairs, finally beginning to build a sense of self-worth based on the idea that his past didn't define him. If I kept this secret, I would be building our entire future family on a massive lie, the very same kind of deceit that had shattered his trust in humanity to begin with. But if I told him the horrific truth about where he came from and the blood that ran in his veins, it might completely destroy the fragile confidence he had spent months trying to rebuild. The silence of the house was broken by the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. I quickly closed the file, but it was too late. Leo stopped at the entrance of the kitchen, his sharp eyes catching the official county seal stamped on the front of the folder. Leo's gaze remained pinned to the folder. The warm, relaxed expression he had carried earlier that evening vanished, replaced instantly by the rigid posture of a boy who had learned long ago that surprises usually meant bad news. He didn't step into the kitchen. He just stood in the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets, watching me with a look that was half curious and half defensive. "What's that?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but the light, natural rhythm we had cultivated over the past few weeks was gone. The defensive wall was already rebuilt, brick by brick. I placed my palm flat over the front of the manila envelope, attempting a calm, reassuring smile that felt hollow even to me. "Just paperwork for the adoption process, Leo. Caseworker files, financial records, standard state forms. He didn't move. His eyes drifted from the envelope up to my face, reading my expression with the surgical precision of someone who had survived 9 different foster homes by studying adult body language. He knew when someone was telling him half a truth. "Is it my file?" he asked, stepping slowly toward the table. "The one from the state." "Leo, it's mostly legal documents," I said, keeping my voice steady while my heart hammered against my ribs. "Things the court needs before we can schedule the final hearing." "You said you weren't going to read it," he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice, just a deep, crushing disappointment that cut far deeper than a shout. "When I moved in, you said you didn't care what some social worker wrote about me on paper. You said you wanted to judge me for yourself." "And I meant that," I replied, standing up from the table. "Everything I told you is still true. Nothing in any file is ever going to change how I feel about you or whether I want you in this family." Leo looked at the closed folder, his mouth drawn into a tight, hard line. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the gentle patter of rain against the window pane. He looked down at his shoes, swallowed hard, and then met my eyes again. "Does it say why they dropped me off?" he asked. The question hung in the air like a physical weight. The official story, the comfortable lie manufactured by the state, was that his biological parents were barely 18, destitute, and left him at a local fire station because they were too young and overwhelmed to care for an infant. It was a painful narrative, but it was a simple one. It allowed him to believe his parents had at least cared enough to ensure he landed somewhere safe. The reality staring back at me from under my palm was vastly different. His father hadn't been a scared, impoverished teenager. He had been a 30-year-old criminal with a long history of violent offenses, a man who had intentionally committed a severe crime, completely abandoning his wife and child to evade federal authorities. Worse still, the file revealed that his father had explicitly tried to take Leo with him as leverage before the authorities intervened, resulting in a terrifying legal standoff that ultimately severed all parental rights and landed his father in maximum security. The state had fabricated the fire station story to keep Leo's location hidden and shield him from the lingering public horror of his father's trial. Looking at Leo now, standing in my kitchen with his shoulders slouched and his eyes desperate for reassurance, I felt the full weight of the moral trap I was caught in. If I maintained the lie, I was building our father-son relationship on a foundation of state-sponsored deceit. But if I told him the truth right now, just as he was recovering from his suspension at school and finally feeling like he wasn't a monster, it could shatter his sense of identity. He was already terrified that he inherited a violent temper. Learning the truth about his father's real nature might convince him that he was genetically broken. "Leo," I began, carefully choosing every word, "your background file has restricted court notes that were sealed for a reason. They were written when you were a baby, long before you had any say in your life." "That didn't answer my question, David," he said, calling me by my first name, a retreat back to the distance of our early days. "Does it tell the truth, or does it just say what everyone else thinks about me?" "It tells a legal story," I said, leaning against the counter. "It doesn't tell your story. And it certainly doesn't define who you are." He stared at the table for a few seconds longer, his jaw working as he wrestled with his thoughts. He didn't push further. Instead, he pulled his hands out of his pockets, turned around without another word, and headed back up the stairs. A moment later, I heard the faint, distinct click of his bedroom door locking from the inside. The rest of the week passed in a tense, watchful quiet. The easy banter we had shared in the garage vanished. Leo completed his school suspension assignments at the dining table, worked silently, and retired to his room early every night. I tried to give him space while remaining accessible, but the heavy envelope sitting inside my locked desk drawer felt like a barrier drawn straight through the house. On Friday afternoon, Sarah Jenkins made her scheduled home visit. She sat in the living room with a clipboard in her lap, her warm posture contrasting sharp with the professional authority she held over Leo's future. "The school spoke with me," Sarah said softly, taking a sip of the coffee I had offered her. "They praised how you handled the situation with Tyler. Most foster parents would have demanded a transfer after an incident involving physical violence. You stood by him. That made an impression on the department, David." "He was pushed, Sarah," I said, sitting in the armchair opposite her. "He reacted out of pain, not malice. He's a good kid." "I know he is," she nodded, setting her cup down. "Which brings us to the final paperwork. The court signed off on the unsealing order. You have the full record now, right?" "I do," I said, my voice dropping slightly. "I read it." Sarah's expression hardened into something serious and guarded. "Then you understand why the state kept those files closed. When children find out their biological parents weren't just helpless, but actively dangerous or malicious, it almost always destabilizes them. The psychological report strongly recommends that the truth remain withheld until he reaches legal adulthood." "So you're asking me to lie to him," I said directly. "Every single day, while asking him to trust me." "I'm asking you to protect him," Sarah countered firmly. "Leo spent 5 years believing he was abandoned because he wasn't loved. If he finds out his father was a violent felon who used him as a pawn, he won't just feel unloved, he'll feel damned. He already worries he has a dark streak. What do you think that information will do to a 15-year-old boy?" I didn't answer. Her words echoed the exact fear that had kept me awake for the last 3 nights. What neither of us realized was that Leo wasn't in his room upstairs. He had come down the hallway to fetch a glass of water, and he was standing just beyond the dining room archway, completely hidden from view, listening to every single word. The air in the room seemed to freeze. I didn't see Leo at first, but I felt the sudden shift in the house, a sharp, subtle draft as the hallway floorboard groaned under the shift of weight. I turned my head just enough to catch the shadow cast across the dining room doorway. Sarah was still speaking, completely unaware that our private conversation was no longer private. "The psychological evaluation from his 7th placement explicitly noted that Leo internalizes blame," she continued, her voice measured and clinical. "If he discovers the full extent of his father's criminal history and the standoff, he will connect his own anger issues directly to his father's bloodline. He's not mentally equipped to process that kind of burden right now, David." I stood up abruptly, cutting Sarah off mid-sentence. "Sarah, let's discuss this later." She blinked, confused by my sudden interruption, but followed my gaze toward the archway. By the time I stepped into the dining room, the hallway was empty. The front door was pulled slightly open, allowing the cold rain to spray across the entryway tile. "Leo!" I called out, rushing to the open door. Down the driveway, his tall, lean frame was already moving briskly into the twilight, his hood pulled up, his hands thrust deep into his jacket. He didn't look back when I called his name again. He broke into a run, disappearing around the corner toward the main avenue as the cold Pacific Northwest rain beat down against the pavement. "I'll go after him," Sarah said, stepping out onto the porch behind me, her phone already in hand to alert her supervisor. "No," I said firmly, pulling my coat off the rack by the door. "If you chase him with state vehicles and authority, he'll completely retreat. Let me find him. David, if he goes missing under your watch." "He's not running away from the law, Sarah," I interrupted, looking her dead in the eye. "He's running away from the lie. Give me 2 hours." Without waiting for her reply, I grabbed my truck keys and stepped out into the pouring rain. Searching for a teenager who doesn't want to be found in a rainy suburban town is nearly impossible unless you know how they think. Leo didn't go to the local parks, the convenience stores, or the places where high school kids usually gathered. He avoided crowds and open spaces. I drove slowly down the main strip, checking the dark alleys, the covered bus stops, and the perimeter of the public library. 30 minutes passed. The rain grew heavier, drummed loudly against the windshield of my old pickup. My mind raced back to every conversation we had ever shared. I remembered the long Saturday morning in the garage, the quiet hours sitting in the living room while he read through my bookshelf, and the way his eyes mapped out the exits every time he entered a new room. He didn't run to hide. He ran to find higher ground where he could see what was coming. I pulled the truck onto the gravel shoulder near the old industrial bridge at the edge of town, a forgotten structural relic overlooking the river that cut through the valley. It was elevated, secluded, and completely overlooked by the rest of the town. I cut the engine, stepped out into the storm, and walked up the slick pedestrian pathway lining the edge of the bridge. Sure enough, sitting on the rusted metal beam just beneath the concrete overhang, completely drenched and staring down at the churning black water below, was Leo. I didn't rush over. I didn't yell. I walked slowly, ensuring my footsteps were heavy enough for him to hear my approach so I wouldn't startle him. I leaned against the cold railing a few feet away, letting the rain soak through my coat as I watched the water roll beneath us. For 3 long minutes, neither of us said a word. "You lied to me," Leo said finally. His voice was raw, stripped of all defensive sarcasm, trembling slightly from the biting cold. "You said you didn't care about the files. But you were talking about my blood like I'm some kind of dangerous disease." "I didn't lie about how I feel about you, Leo," I said softly, keeping my posture relaxed. "I made a promise to judge you based on who you are with me. And that hasn't changed." "I heard her," Leo shouted, turning his face toward me. Tears were mixing with the rain streaming down his pale cheeks, his eyes burning with a painful, desperate rage. "She said my father was dangerous. She said I'm not mentally equipped to handle it. What did he do, David? Am I going to turn out like him? Is that why every family gave up on me?" The raw horror in his question hit me straight in the chest. This was the exact nightmare Sarah had warned me about, the crushing, toxic belief that he was inherently broken, doomed by his DNA to become a monster. "Every family before this one gave up because they were looking for a perfect kid, Leo," I said, stepping closer until I was standing right beside him at the railing. "They weren't looking for you. And your father's choices have absolutely nothing to do with who you choose to be." "Then tell me," Leo screamed over the roar of the river below. "Stop protecting me. Stop treating me like I'm made of glass. If I'm going to live in your house, I need to know what kind of blood is inside me." I looked at him, so drenched, so terrified, standing on the edge of a choice that would determine whether he built a life with me or spent the rest of his youth running from phantom shadows. The state ordered me to stay silent. The psychological reports commanded me to maintain the protective lie. But looking into his eyes, I realized that keeping the secret wouldn't protect him. It would only leave him alone in the dark, imagining horrors far worse than the truth. I took a deep breath, reaching out to place a steady, warm hand on his trembling shoulder. "Okay," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the wind. "I'll tell you everything. But you have to come home with me right now, sit at the table, and listen to the whole truth, not just the bad parts." Leo stared at me, his breathing heavy, searching my face for any trace of deceit. After what felt like an eternity, he wiped his face with the back of his soaked sleeve and gave a single, slow nod. The heater in the truck hummed loudly, blowing warm air against our soaked clothes as we drove back through the dark, rain-swept streets. Neither of us spoke. Leo stared out the passenger window, watching the streetlights stretch into long, blurred streaks of yellow and red across the wet glass. His hands were tucked tight into his coat pockets, but I could see his shoulders trembling, not just from the cold, but from the terrifying anticipation of what was waiting for him at the kitchen table. When we pulled into the driveway, Sarah's car was gone. She had left a short text message on my phone. "I have to report that he ran. We need to talk in the morning." I deleted the notification, locked my phone, and put it away. Tonight wasn't about state reports, caseworkers, or legal protocol. It was about two people in a house deciding if they were going to be a family built on truth or another temporary stop on a long, painful road. Inside, I handed Leo a dry towel and a warm fleece sweater. He dried his hair silently, tossed the towel over a dining chair, and walked straight to the kitchen table. He sat down in the exact same chair he had occupied hours earlier, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the center of the wooden table where the heavy manila envelope still sat under the soft amber light of the pendant lamp. I poured 2 mugs of hot tea, placed one in front of him, and sat down across from him. I pulled the envelope toward me, unclasped the metal fastener, and drew out the 16 pages of court documents. "Before I read a single line of this, Leo, I need you to promise me something," I said, my voice quiet, grounded, and unwavering. "You have to listen to the whole story. Not just the police reports, not just the charges, but what happened after. Can you do that for me?" Leo swallowed hard, his throat moving nervously. He gave a firm nod. "I'm listening." I took a deep breath, looking down at the yellowing pages stamped with official seals. "Your biological father's name was Arthur Vance. 15 years ago, when you were just a baby, Arthur wasn't a teenager like the state told you. He was 30 years old. He was a man who lived outside the law, involved in high-level theft and financial extortion." Leo didn't flinch, but his fingers tightened around his warm tea mug, his knuckles turning white. "Go on," he whispered. "When federal authorities finally caught up with his operation, Arthur panicked," I continued, turning a page to the official incident log. "Instead of turning himself in, he tried to run. But he didn't run alone. He took you and your mother with him, using you as leverage to try and stop law enforcement from closing in on him. He brought a standoff to a residential neighborhood, putting your life and your mother's life at serious risk just to protect himself." A heavy silence descended upon the kitchen. I watched Leo's face closely. I could see the internal storm raging behind his dark eyes, the sickening realization that the man who gave him life had used him as a human shield. "So he didn't abandon me because he cared," Leo said, his voice dropping to a harsh, brittle whisper. "He abandoned me because he got caught. He didn't drop me off at a fire station out of love. He got arrested, and I was just collateral damage." "He was arrested, yes," I said firmly. "He was sentenced to 25 years in a federal facility. But that's only half of the story, Leo." Leo looked up, his eyes defensive and clouded with pain. "What other half?" "He was a monster, David. And everyone in the system knew it. That's why those foster families kicked me out, isn't it? Because every time I got mad, every time I lost my temper, they saw him in me." "No," I replied, leaning forward and placing my hand firmly on the table near his. "They kicked you out because they were scared of an angry teenager, and they were too lazy to look past the surface. But listen to me carefully, Leo. There's another person in this file. Someone you've never been told about." I turned to page 9 of the document, slid it across the wood, and pointed to a faded black-and-white photograph attached to the corner of a hospital intake record. Leo stared down at the photo. It was a young woman in her early 20s, with delicate features, tired eyes, and the exact same sharp brow and dark, expressive eyes that Leo carried. "Who is she?" Leo asked, his voice suddenly losing its defensive edge, replaced by a delicate, fragile curiosity. "Her name was Elena," I said softly. "She was your mother. And what the state never told you, what even the caseworkers forgot to emphasize, is what she did during that standoff." Leo's eyes stayed pinned to the photograph. "What did she do?" "Your father tried to take you with him when he fled the house," I read directly from the sealed officer's statement. "Elena stood between him and the door. She took you out of his arms, locked herself in a back room with you, and held the door shut against him until the police broke through the windows. She took the full force of his violence to ensure that not a single hand touched you." Leo's breath hitched. He stared at the faded picture, his thumb gently reaching out to touch the edge of the paper. "Your mother saved your life that night, Leo," I said softly. "She didn't abandon you either. She was severely injured during the arrest, and her health deteriorated rapidly over the following year. Before she passed away in a state care facility, she signed protective custody papers specifically demanding that you be placed in a closed adoption, so Arthur could never, ever trace where you went when he eventually got out." Tears began to fall quietly from Leo's eyes, dripping onto the warm wood of the table. The anger that had consumed him on the bridge seemed to melt away, leaving behind a deep, aching grief for a mother he had never known, a woman who had fought for him with her last ounce of strength. "She wanted you to have a clean start," I whispered. "The state lied to you about the fire station because they were terrified your father's associates might find you. They thought hiding the truth was keeping you safe. But they forgot to tell you that you didn't just come from a man who made terrible choices. You came from a woman who loved you enough to shield you with her life." Leo sat frozen, staring at his mother's face as the truth washed over him. For the first time in his life, he didn't look like a boy burdened by dark blood. He looked like a son who had finally found his roots. He wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, swallowed the lump in his throat, and looked up at me. "Is he still in prison?" I hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking down at the final page of the legal file, a page stamped with a recent red update seal from the Department of Corrections that I hadn't noticed until 5 minutes before Leo had come downstairs. My heart sank into my chest as I read the bold, freshly printed text at the bottom of the document. Subject: Arthur Vance. Status: granted early parole due to facility overcrowding. Released 3 weeks ago. The cold reality of those words seemed to strip all the warmth from the kitchen. Early parole. 3 weeks ago. I kept my hand flat over the bottom of the page, shielding the red stamp from Leo's view. He had just received the first piece of genuine peace in his entire life, the knowledge that his mother had fought for him, that he wasn't born out of pure malice or neglect. Throwing Arthur's sudden release at him right now would shatter that fragile healing before it even had a chance to take root. "Leo," I said, carefully folding the file closed and placing it back inside the envelope, "you've carried enough weight for one night. Go up, get some sleep. Tomorrow is a new day, and we'll take it one step at a time." Leo looked at the closed folder, then up at me. The sharp, guarded suspicion in his eyes was gone, replaced by an expression I hadn't seen in him before: relief. It was subtle, but it was there, a softness around his jaw, a posture that no longer looked like he was bracing for an attack. "Thanks, David," he said softly. He stood up, hesitated for a moment, and then offered a small, awkward nod before heading toward the stairs. This time, when his bedroom door closed upstairs, there was no sound of a key turning in the lock. I sat at the kitchen table until 2 a.m., staring at the closed envelope. Arthur Vance was out. The protective order issued 15 years ago was still legally binding, but state systems were notoriously slow, and records unsealed for adoption proceedings often left digital footprints. If Arthur was looking for the son he once tried to use as collateral, how long would it take him to find a quiet suburban address in Seattle? Early the next morning, I drove to the county social services office. The building was a dreary concrete block in downtown Tacoma, humming with the quiet, bureaucratic exhaustion of social workers under relentless pressure. Sarah Jenkins was at her desk, surrounded by stacks of paper folders. When she saw me walk into her cubicle, her face hardened. "David," she said, leaning back in her swivel chair and sighing, "I got your message last night. Running off into the rain with a minor while under department evaluation is a severe breach of protocol. I was required to file an incident flag." "I don't care about the incident flag, Sarah," I said, leaning over her desk and keeping my voice low so the surrounding workers wouldn't hear. "Why wasn't I notified that Arthur Vance was paroled 3 weeks ago?" Sarah froze. The professional annoyance on her face instantly dissolved into genuine shock. She pulled up her computer monitor, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she accessed the State Department of Corrections registry. As she read the screen, the color visibly drained from her face. This wasn't updated in his adoption file when the unsealing order was issued," Sarah stammered, looking up at me with wide eyes. "The parole board released him to a halfway house in Spokane on a conditional sentence. It wasn't logged into the child welfare database." "He's less than 300 miles away," I said, my voice trembling with controlled fury. "Leo's background file was unsealed 4 days ago. Does Arthur have access to legal representation that could track court filings?" Sarah swallowed hard, rapidly clicking through legal notices. If he filed a motion to locate missing family members through a secondary attorney, which paroled felons sometimes do to establish residency, he could potentially request public court dockets. "David, the unsealing petition had your home address listed on the primary filing." A cold panic seized my chest. The very system designed to protect Leo had just laid a breadcrumb trail straight to my front door. "Is he looking for him?" I demanded. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, pulling out a fresh set of legal forms. "I'm flagging this immediately with federal probation. But you need to understand something. If Arthur attempts contact, or if the court deems there is a potential safety risk, Leo's adoption status will be frozen instantly. The state will relocate him to a secure, anonymous facility out of state until the threat is assessed." "No," I said instantly, slamming my hand down on her desk. "You are not taking him out of my house. He just started trusting me. He just found out his mother saved his life. If you pull him out now and stick him back in the system, it will destroy him." "It's not my call, David. It's state law," Sarah argued, her voice tight with stress. "If a biological parent with a violent record poses a threat to a ward of the state, we are legally required to move the child." I stood straight, taking a deep breath to force the panic back down. "How long do I have before the review board sees the parole flag?" 48 hours, Sarah said quietly. "On Monday morning, the systemic audit runs. When it flags Arthur's release alongside the unsealed adoption file, the emergency transfer order will be generated automatically." I left the building into the gray morning air, my mind spinning. I had 48 hours to figure out how to shield Leo, not just from a biological father who might be searching for him, but from a system ready to rip him out of the only real home he had ever known. When I pulled back into my driveway an hour later, my heart nearly stopped. Parked across the street, sitting quietly under the rain-dripping branches of a large oak tree, was an unfamiliar dark sedan with rusted wheel wells. The engine was off, but through the rain-streaked windshield, I could make out the silhouette of a man sitting in the driver's seat, staring intently at my front porch. I pulled my truck slowly into the driveway, keeping my eyes fixed on the side mirror. The sedan across the street didn't move. The silhouette in the driver's seat remained completely still, a dark outline framed by the gray afternoon rain. My hands tightened against the steering wheel as every instinct screamed at me to get inside and lock the doors. I turned off the ignition, stepped out into the cool air, and purposely took my time walking to the front porch, keeping my posture relaxed while my mind raced through every possible scenario. If that was Arthur Vance, how had he tracked us down so quickly? Had he monitored the court registry the moment the adoption petition was filed, or had someone inside the legal system leaked the records? Inside the house, the living room was quiet. Leo was sitting at the kitchen island, a school textbook open in front of him, eating an apple. The tension that had dominated his posture for months was noticeably absent. He looked up when I walked in, giving me a small, genuine smile. "Hey," he said. "Everything okay with the county office?" "Just checking off more boxes for the final hearing," I said, forcing my voice to stay even as I walked over to the front window and glanced through the wooden blinds. The dark sedan was still sitting under the oak tree across the street. "Leo, do me a favor. Stay inside this afternoon. I have some phone calls to make and a few errands to wrap up in the garage." He nodded without suspicion, returning to his reading. Seeing him so calm, so rooted in the belief that he was finally safe, sent a cold wave of determination through me. I wasn't going to let his past steal this life from him. I went straight to my home office, pulled out my laptop, and accessed the public records portal for the county court. As a schoolteacher, I had clear access to legal aid networks and youth advocacy groups. I reached out directly to a retired family court attorney I had known for years, explaining the situation without using specific names: a paroled felon, a sealed file unsealed for adoption, and an automated state system set to initiate an emergency relocation of the child in less than 48 hours. If the system flags an safety conflict, Arthur's old legal contact told me over the phone, the state's priority is zero risk. They will move the boy to a secure, out-of-county group shelter on Monday morning. Your only legal lever to stop an automatic emergency order is to file an expedited petition for immediate temporary custody before the state audit runs. "How long does that take?" I asked. "You need a judge to sign off on an emergency order before 8 a.m. Monday," he replied grimly. "That gives you roughly 36 hours, and you need concrete evidence that staying with you is safer than state relocation, or proof that the biological parent poses an imminent, specific threat that can be legally restrained without moving the child." I thanked him and hung up, looking out the window once more. The dark sedan was gone. The empty space under the oak tree felt even more threatening than the car itself. He was moving, watching, and gathering information. That evening, as the rain turned into a steady, misting drizzle, I heard a knock at the front door. I instructed Leo to stay in the kitchen and walked slowly to the entryway. I pulled back the curtain on the side window, expecting to see a social worker or police officer. Instead, standing on the porch, wrapped in a worn leather jacket with his shoulders hunched against the damp air, was a tall, lean man in his late 40s. His hair was graying at the temples, his face lined with the sharp, hollow contours of someone who had spent years behind heavy iron bars. Even through the glass, the resemblance was unmistakable. He had the same sharp brow, the same posture, the same structure as the boy sitting 20 feet away in my kitchen. Arthur Vance was standing on my porch. I opened the door, stepping out onto the threshold and pulling the door almost entirely shut behind me, blocking his view of the interior hallway. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice low, flat, and hard. The man looked at me, his cold eyes scanning my face, assessing me with an eerie, quiet calculation. He took his hands out of his jacket pockets, showing open palms in a gesture that felt practiced rather than genuine. "David Miller?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. "I think you have something that belongs to me." The audacity of his words sent a jolt of cold anger straight down my spine. Something that belongs to me. He didn't say, "my son." He didn't say, "Leo." He spoke like a collector claiming lost property, his voice lacking even a trace of paternal warmth. "You're standing on private property, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping an octave, deadpan and steady. "And you are violating a permanent protective order issued 15 years ago. If you take one step closer to this door, the police will be here before you can turn around." Arthur didn't flinch. A faint, bitter smile tugged at the corner of his cracked lips. He leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as he assessed me. "That old order was filed under a false pretense by a dead woman and a state system that lied to the courts," Arthur said smoothly, his tone terrifyingly calm. "I served my time. I paid my debt to the state. And the moment those legal records were unsealed for your cute little adoption request, your address became public record for anyone with a decent lawyer. He's my blood, Miller. You're just a schoolteacher filling an empty house." "He isn't your property," I replied, stepping firmly into his space on the porch, physically blocking the doorway. "He knows who you are now, Arthur. He knows what you did to his mother. He knows you used him as a human shield. If you think he's waiting in there to welcome you back with open arms, you're dead wrong." For a split second, the slick, confident facade slipped. Arthur's jaw tightened, a dark, volatile spark flashing in his eyes, the raw, dangerous instability that the confidential files had warned about. But just as quickly, he forced a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "You think you know him because he lives under your roof?" Arthur whispered, leaning close enough for me to smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "He's got my temper, teacher. I've read his foster logs. 9 placements. Explosive violence. Suspended just last week for breaking a kid's jaw. You can dress him up in suburban clothes all you want, but when the pressure hits, he's going to snap. And when the state finds out I'm back in the picture, they'll pull him out of this house so fast your head will spin." He took 2 steps backward down the porch stairs, pulling his collar up against the rain. "I'm not here to break down your door tonight," Arthur said, looking past my shoulder toward the dark glass of the hallway window. "I'm going to let the system do it for me. On Monday morning, my lawyer files for parental rights reinstatement based on procedural errors in the original custody termination. The state will put him in a holding facility the moment the conflict is registered. Enjoy your weekend, David." He turned and walked down the driveway, disappearing into the dark, misting rain toward the main street. I stood on the porch, my pulse racing, rain soaking through my shirt. He wasn't trying to kidnap Leo in the middle of the night. He was using the law as a weapon to force the state to tear us apart. If the department transferred Leo to a secure facility on Monday, Arthur's legal team would drag the proceedings out for months, keeping Leo isolated, terrified, and vulnerable to manipulation. I closed the front door, locked it, and turned around. Leo was standing at the end of the hallway, right beside the dining room archway. He had heard every single word. His face was deadly pale, his hands shaking at his sides. The fragile peace he had built over the last 24 hours was completely shattered. "He came here," Leo whispered, his voice choking back a wave of panic. "He's going to make the state take me away, isn't he? They're going to put me back in a shelter." "No," I said, walking briskly down the hallway and grabbing him by the shoulders, forcing him to look me straight in the eyes. "Listen to me, Leo. I am not letting anyone take you out of this house. Not your father, not Sarah, and not the state of Washington." "How?" Leo cried out, a tear spilling over his eyelash as his voice broke. "He said I'm just like him. He said I have his temper. What if he's right, David? What if the court looks at my record and decides I belong with him or in a facility? Because your record doesn't define you, and neither does his blood. I shouted back passionately, gripping his arms firmly. He came here expecting to find a terrified boy and a passive teacher. He thinks we're going to wait around until Monday morning for the system to decide our lives. He's wrong. I pulled my truck keys off the hook by the wall and grabbed my laptop bag. What are we doing? Leo asked, wiping his face, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. We have 36 hours before the courts open on Monday, I said, my voice hardening with an absolute, unshakable resolve. We aren't hiding, and we aren't waiting for them to act. We're going to build a legal defense that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that you are my son, and we're going to force a judge to sign those final adoption papers before Arthur's lawyer even steps foot in that courthouse. Leo stared at me, the terror in his eyes slowly giving way to something powerful, a spark of fierce, unyielding determination that he had never possessed before. "What do you need me to do?" he asked quietly. I looked at him, knowing that the next 24 hours would test everything we had built. "I need you to stand up and fight for your future." The next 36 hours were a blur of adrenaline, relentless determination, and absolute focus. Instead of hiding in fear, we went on the offensive. By Saturday afternoon, my retired attorney friend, Arthur's old court records, and I had put together an emergency motion for expedited finalization of adoption, paired with a permanent restraining order against Arthur Vance. We spent all of Sunday gathering character affidavits, not just from my colleagues, but from a high school vice principal, Leo's teachers, and even the family of the boy Leo had defended himself against. They didn't see a dangerous, broken teenager anymore. They saw a young man fighting for his dignity, anchored by a parent who refused to give up on him. When Monday morning arrived, the sky over downtown Tacoma was clear, the rain finally yielding to a crisp, pale blue morning light. At 7:30 a.m., half an hour before the state audit was scheduled to flag Arthur's release and issue the automated relocation order, we stepped into Judge Eleanor Vance's courtroom on the 4th floor of the county courthouse. Sarah Jenkins was already there, holding her thick folder, her eyes wide with shock as she saw us walk in with legal counsel. "David," Sarah whispered, rushing over to us in the gallery, "what are you doing? The state system is going to process the audit at 8. If there's a contested claim—" "There is no contested claim, Sarah," I said firmly, handing her a copy of our emergency motion. "Because we are asking the judge to finalize this adoption right now, based on clear and convincing evidence that Leo's safety, stability, and legal rights are best secured under my permanent guardianship." Before Sarah could respond, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Arthur Vance walked in, flanked by a court-appointed public defender he had retained over the weekend. He was wearing a dark suit that fit him poorly, attempting to present the image of a reformed, concerned biological father. But as his eyes locked onto mine, and then shifted to Leo, the cold, calculating arrogance from 2 nights ago flashed across his face. He believed the system's bureaucratic slowness was on his side. He believed he had already won. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Eleanor Vance took the bench. The judge reviewed the emergency petition in silence for 10 agonizing minutes. The only sound in the courtroom was the quiet rustle of papers and the ticking of the wall clock. "Mr. Miller," Judge Vance said finally, looking over her glasses at me, "this is an extraordinary procedure. The state child welfare system has an automated protocol designed to isolate minors when high-risk biological relatives emerge." "Your Honor," my attorney stepped forward, "the state's protocol was created to protect children from harm, not to lock them back into a broken system when they have already found a safe, permanent, and loving home." Leo Vance has spent 5 years being moved from house to house because people were afraid of his past. For the first time in his life, he has stability. His mother gave her life to shield him from Arthur Vance. Dragging him into a prolonged legal custody battle with a newly paroled felon will inflict the very trauma his mother died to prevent. Judge Vance looked over at Arthur's attorney. Does the biological father have a formal counterpetition filed? Arthur's attorney cleared his throat nervously. Your Honor, my client was only paroled 3 weeks ago. We intend to file for a stay of adoption pending a parental rights review. Intend to file? Judge Vance interrupted, her tone sharp as a razor. Which means as of 7:45 a.m. today, there is no active legal motion blocking this proceeding. Furthermore, I have reviewed Mr. Vance's criminal history, the sealed termination records from 15 years ago, and the police statements detailing the circumstances of his conviction. The biological father's parental rights were legally severed for cause. She then turned her eyes toward the gallery, looking directly at Leo. Leo, the judge said, her voice softening significantly. Stand up, please. Leo stood up immediately. His shoulders were squared, his chin held high. The timid, hyper-vigilant boy who had spent his first night mapping out the exit doors of my house was nowhere to be seen. You have heard everything about your past, Judge Vance said gently. You have heard the arguments from the state, and you see the man standing across this courtroom. I want to hear from you. What do you want? Leo took a slow, deep breath. He didn't look at Arthur. He didn't look down at the floor. He looked straight at the judge, his voice echoing clearly through the high-ceilinged room. For 15 years, I thought I was abandoned because I was broken, Leo said, his voice steady and calm. I thought the anger inside me meant I belonged to a past I couldn't change. But David showed me that I'm not defined by where I came from. I'm defined by who I choose to be today. My mother fought to give me a chance at a real life, and David is the only person who ever fought to keep me there. I don't want to run anymore, Your Honor. I want to go home with my father. A profound silence settled over the room. Sarah Jenkins pulled out a tissue, quietly wiping a tear from her eye. Arthur took a step forward, opening his mouth to speak, but his attorney quickly grabbed his arm, knowing the battle was lost. Judge Vance smiled softly, picked up her gavel, and looked down at the documents before her. The court finds that it is overwhelmingly in the best interest of the child to finalize this adoption immediately, without delay, she declared, her voice firm and resolute. The emergency motion is granted. The adoption of Leo Miller is officially finalized. A permanent restraining order against Arthur Vance is hereby reinstated and extended indefinitely. Gavel strikes desk. We are adjourned. As the courtroom cleared, Arthur was escorted out by court officers, casting one final bitter look over his shoulder. But Leo didn't even notice. He turned to me, a massive, unburdened smile breaking across his face, the first true, unfiltered smile I had ever seen on him. We walked out of the courthouse together into the clear morning sun, leaving the shadows of the past exactly where they belonged, behind us. Every choice we make leaves a mark on the people we love. Sometimes protecting the people in our lives means shielding them from painful truths, but as David and Leo learned, true healing only begins when we face the past with honesty, courage, and unconditional love. Thank you so much for watching this story on Truth or Choice. If this episode touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story. If you or someone you know has ever faced a difficult choice between keeping a painful secret or revealing the truth to protect someone you love, please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Sharing your story might help someone else walking through a similar valley. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Now it's your turn. If you were in this situation, would you choose the truth or make a different choice? Tell us in the comments.